February 14, 1943. Kahili Airfield, Bougainville. 12 American aircraft climbed toward the Solomon Islands sun, escorting a formation of B-24 Liberators on a bombing run they will not complete. 4 P-38 Lightnings, 6 P-40 Warhawks, 2 brand-new F4U Corsairs, the first of their kind to fly a combat mission in the Pacific War. Above them, more than 40 Japanese Zero fighters are already climbing to meet them, vectored in by coast watchers who had seen this raid coming for hours. What happens next will be scrubbed from press releases for weeks. 4 P-38s go down, 2 P-40s go down, 2 of the Liberators are lost, and 2 of the new Corsairs, the fighter the U.S. Navy had spent 3 years and a small fortune developing, the fighter that was supposed to finally answer the Zero, are shot out of the sky on their first day of war. The Americans claim 4 Japanese fighters in return. Post-war Japanese records will confirm barely any losses on their side at all. Marine and Army airmen will call it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and for a long time, nobody outside the South Pacific Theater will hear the name at all. The men who flew it that afternoon were still learning the airplane's habits in the middle of combat, how it liked to bounce hard on a rough strip, how the long nose swallowed the horizon on takeoff, how the huge engine up front made the whole airframe feel less like a fighter and more like a runaway locomotive with wings bolted to it. None of that mattered once the Zeros arrived from altitude. What mattered was that 12 escort fighters had been asked to protect a formation of heavy bombers over one of the most heavily defended patches of sky in the entire South Pacific, and had done it with a machine barely out of its own flight testing program. The Corsair, a machine so fast, so powerful, so radically overbuilt for its era that it would still be shooting down enemy aircraft in a different war 7 years later, had just been humiliated by the same enemy fighter it was designed to kill. The Marines who flew home that afternoon didn't talk about superiority. They talked about survival. This is the story of how that happened, and it is the story of why, 18 months later, Japanese pilots would come to fear the sound of a Corsair's engine more than almost anything else in the sky, not because the airplane changed, but because of who was flying it and what it cost to learn. 54 years after that first mission, an old man in Fukuoka, Japan, sits down at a low writing table with a fountain pen and a stack of blank paper. He is in his early 80s now. He wears glasses over an eye that has been half-blind since 1942. His name is Saburo Sakai, and for most of his life, Japan's newspapers have called him the country's greatest surviving fighter ace, a man credited, depending on whose count you believe, with somewhere between 28 confirmed kills and 64 claimed ones. He has spent decades being asked the same question by American veterans, Japanese schoolchildren, and documentary crews. What was it like, watching the Zero lose the war it was supposed to win? He has learned, slowly and at real cost to his own legend, that the honest answer is more complicated than the one people want to hear. He is not interested anymore in defending the myth of the invincible Japanese pilot. He lived long enough to watch that myth get dismantled from the inside, one dead friend at a time. What he is about to describe, in memoirs, in interviews, in the quiet last years of a life that almost ended in a cockpit off Guadalcanal in 1942, is not a story about which airplane was better. It is a story about what an air force can afford to lose and what it cannot. To understand what happened to Saburo Sakai, you have to go back further, to the years when the Zero was not a cautionary tale. It was a miracle. In December 1941 and through the first half of 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was, without real argument, the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. It could outturn anything the Allies had in the air. It could outclimb it. And it could do something no Western naval architect thought possible in a single-engine fighter. It could fly over 1,000 miles, fight, and fly home. Zero pilots escorted bombers to targets Allied planners considered safely out of fighter range. then appeared out of the sun and tore the defending fighters apart. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Wherever the Zero appeared, Allied pilots were given the same standing order: do not turn with it, do not try to outfly it, just try to survive it. Junichi Sasai understood exactly what he was flying. 24 years old, the son of a naval officer, a lieutenant junior grade with the Tainan Air Group, Sasai wore a tiger head belt buckle his father had given him and kept a portrait of a legendary samurai warrior in his quarters. His men called him the Prince of Rabaul. On May 4, 1942, over Lee, New Guinea, he shot down 3 American P-39 fighters in 20 seconds. By August of that year, his confirmed score stood at 27. He was, by any measure available at the time, one of the deadliest fighter pilots alive. Under his command flew a 25-year-old petty officer named Saburo Sakai, a farmer's son from Saga Prefecture who had clawed his way into naval aviation and out of the enlisted ranks through sheer flying skill. Sakai idolized Sasai. He would later write that his commander scolded him like a strict older brother and fought like an artist. Between them and their squadron mates, the Tainan Air Group racked up victory after victory over New Guinea, and that August, over the newly contested skies of Guadalcanal. The unit Sasai and Sakai flew with, the Tainan Air Group, was by the summer of 1942 arguably the most lethal fighter squadron on either side of the Pacific War, stacked with pilots who would go on to become some of the highest-scoring aces in Japanese history. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, later credited with more victories than any other Japanese pilot of the war, flew in the same formations, on the same missions, out of the same muddy strips at Lee and Rabaul. Sakai would later describe those months in New Guinea, before Guadalcanal changed everything, as the closest thing to an unbeatable run he ever experienced in the air bomber escorts that met no serious opposition, dogfights that ended in one-sided victories, a sense among the whole air group that no Allied fighter built could touch them if they simply held their turns and trusted the airplane. It was, by every account that survives from the men who lived through it, an intoxicating way to fight a war. Overconfidence has a way of arriving quietly, in the space between one easy war and the next hard one. Nobody in the Tainan Air Group in the summer of 1942 believed the war in the Solomons would be any different from the one they had already won. He had 19 days left to live. Behind Sasai's cockpit, and behind every Zero in the Imperial Navy, sat a design philosophy built entirely around one idea: weight was the enemy, and everything else was negotiable. At a drafting table in Nagoya, Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi had been handed a set of Japanese Navy specifications in 1937 that, on paper, contradicted each other. The new fighter had to outturn and outclimb anything else in the sky. It had to carry cannon as well as machine guns, and it had to fly farther than any single-engine fighter in history, far enough to escort bombers across the vast, empty distances of the Pacific. Horikoshi would later write, with characteristic bluntness, that his team's immediate goal was simply to win the contract, not to imagine what a long war might demand of the airplane. He solved the Navy's contradiction the only way the physics allowed, by stripping the aircraft down to almost nothing. A new, ultralight aluminum alloy from Sumitomo Metals shaved weight out of the airframe. The wing was built as a single continuous spar to eliminate heavy joints. And 2 decisions, made almost as afterthoughts, would define the airplane's entire wartime reputation: no armor plate behind the pilot's seat, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Bulletproofing had not even appeared in the Navy's original list of requirements. Horikoshi did not think it needed to. In 1937, almost no fighter anywhere in the world carried that kind of protection. The case for it wouldn't be made until the Battle of Britain, fought long after the Zero's basic design was frozen. The Zero's engineers assumed, reasonably enough for the moment, that an airplane nobody could catch didn't need much protecting. They had built an airplane that could not afford to be hit. Half a world away, on a very different set of drafting tables, an American aircraft company was chasing a very different problem: how to hang the largest, most powerful engine anyone had ever put on a single-engine fighter onto an airframe small enough to survive a carrier landing. Vought Aircraft's chief engineer, Rex Beisel, had been handed the same brutal 1938 Navy requirement that every American fighter manufacturer was chasing that year: maximum speed, maximum climb, and a brand new Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine putting out roughly 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice what most contemporary fighters carried. An engine that big needed an enormous propeller, and an enormous propeller needed ground clearance a normal straight wing couldn't provide without stilting the landing gear up to absurd, fragile heights. Beisel's team solved it with a wing nobody had built quite that way before: an inverted gull shape, bent down at the root and back up toward the tip, letting the landing gear stay short and strong while the huge 13-foot propeller cleared the deck. It gave the airplane its unmistakable silhouette, and eventually its nickname: Bentwing Bird, Whistling Death, Ensign Eliminator, depending on who was doing the naming and how their day had gone. On May 29, 1940, test pilot Lyman A. Bullard Jr. took the prototype F4U one-up for its first flight from Stratford, Connecticut. Within months, it became the first American fighter in history to exceed 400 miles an hour in level flight, a genuine sensation in an era when most frontline fighters struggled to reach 350. On paper, in raw numbers, Vought had built something that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive the Zero decisively. The dogfight the Navy had been dreading looked, for a moment, like it might already be over before it started. The airplane that could outfly the Zero on paper could barely land on a carrier at all. That same long nose and huge engine that gave the Corsair its speed also blocked the pilot's forward view completely during a carrier approach, when the aircraft's nose rides high and slow. The oleo landing gear struts had a tendency to bounce hard on touchdown, sending the airplane skipping back into the air, sometimes stalling and crashing into the barrier or off the side of the deck. Navy carrier qualification trials in 1942 produced enough wrecked airframes and, in a handful of cases, dead pilots, that the Navy made a decision that would have seemed almost inconceivable given how much money and hope had gone into the program. It pulled the Corsair off its carriers. Instead, the newest, fastest, most expensive fighter in the American arsenal was handed to the United States Marine Corps, to be flown from muddy, coral-crushed island airstrips instead of pitching flight decks, a second-choice assignment for what had been designed as a first-choice airplane. The squadron that got it first was VMF 124, activated at Camp Kearny, California, in September 1942 under the command of a career Marine aviator named Major William Jies. His pilots trained hard and fast because there was no time to do otherwise. By the time the squadron was declared combat-ready in late December, its pilots had logged an average of just 25 hours apiece in the airplane. 25 hours to master a fighter that had already killed test pilots in the hands of far more experienced men. Jies led his 24 Corsairs into Guadalcanal's Fighter II airstrip on the morning of February 12, 1943. Before lunch that same day, 12 of his aircraft were already flying their first combat mission of the war, escorting a rescue seaplane out to pick up 2 downed pilots. It went smoothly. 2 days later came Kahili and the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and the first hard lesson that speed on a data sheet and survival in a dogfight were not the same thing. The mission reports that went up the chain that week were blunt and unflattering, and for a force trying to build public confidence in a very expensive new airplane, they were not the kind of story anyone wanted told. William Jies did not have the luxury of dwelling on it. He had a squadron to rebuild, and a campaign that was not going to wait for the Corsair to prove itself. Back at Imperial Navy headquarters in Rabaul, the after-action reports from that same week told a very different story, and one that was, in its own way, just as dangerous. Zero pilots had claimed 4 American fighters down for minimal loss, and staff officers filed it exactly the way they had filed 100 earlier engagements, as more proof of Japanese aerial supremacy. A junior intelligence officer who cross-checked wreckage counts against pilot claims and found the numbers didn't add up, as they rarely did, on either side, in the fog of a fast-moving dogfight over open water and jungle canopy, found his estimates quietly revised upward before they reached anyone with the authority to act on them. It was an institution that had already stopped listening to bad news, because for a year and a half, there had been so little bad news to hear. The Imperial Navy's entire wartime intelligence culture had been built during a string of one-sided victories, and it had never developed the habit of doubting its own pilots' claims, a habit that grows expensive only when the claims stop matching reality, and by February 1943, over the Solomons, they very often did. What the Marines needed wasn't a faster airplane. They needed a different fight, and the man who worked that fight out did not do it from a headquarters staff chair. He did it from inside a cockpit, over and over, until the numbers made sense. The tactics that would eventually make the Corsair the airplane Japanese pilots feared were not born from a manual. They were born from simple energy math that any Marine squadron could have worked out earlier if anyone had survived long enough to teach it. A Zero could outturn a Corsair in a level, sustained dogfight. That much was true and would stay true for the rest of the war. But a Corsair could outdive a Zero by a wide margin, could take more damage and keep flying, and could climb back to altitude faster after a pass. So the tactic that emerged, refined independently by Marine and Navy squadrons across 1943, was simple to describe and brutal to execute. Never turn with a Zero. Dive on it from above, fire a short burst, and use the Corsair's speed to climb back to altitude before the Zero could turn inside you and fight back. Hit and run, over and over, until the enemy's numbers thinned out and yours didn't. No single pilot invented this doctrine. It was hammered out squadron by squadron, in after-action debriefs and margin notes on combat reports, by men who had watched a friend die trying to turn with a Zero and decided never to make that mistake again. But it took a particular kind of aggressive, undisciplined confidence to fly it well, and Marine Corps Aviation was about to get an unusually large supply of that from one of its most troubled officers. Major William Jies would not live to see the tactic proved out. On May 13, 1943, he led 15 Corsairs on an intercept mission near the Russell Islands, tangling with Zeros of the 204th Air Group in what pilots afterward called the first real fight the Corsairs had had in the region. The Marines came away with a lopsided victory on paper, 16 Zeros claimed for 4 Corsairs lost. Jies was one of the 4. He vanished during the dogfight and never returned to Fighter II. For 2 years, the Marine Corps carried him as missing. His wife waited in La Jolla, California, for word that never definitively arrived. William Jies was formally declared dead on May 14, 1945, 3 months before the war he had helped introduce the Corsair into would finally end, and more than 2 years after he had actually died leading the squadron that made the airplane's reputation. He never knew whether the fighter he had carried into its worst day would ever become what it was designed to be. By late 1943, the airplane he had died flying was becoming exactly that. And the pilot most responsible for cementing its legend was, by any conventional measure, a mess. Gregory Boyington was 30 years old in the fall of 1943, older than almost every pilot he commanded, which is where the nickname came from, Pappy or Gramps, depending on who was doing the teasing. He had grown up poor in Idaho with an alcoholic stepfather, put himself through the University of Washington, and joined the Marine Corps in 1936. By 1941, with debts piling up and his career stalling, he resigned his commission to join Claire Chennault's American volunteer group in China, the Flying Tigers flying P-40s against Japanese aircraft over Burma. It did not go well for him personally. He drank heavily, clashed with commanders, and left the unit under circumstances he later described honestly as messy, having padded his own combat claims from the period in ways that historians still debate today. He rejoined the Marine Corps in September 1942, and by August 1943 was given command of a scratch squadron built from replacement pilots nobody else particularly wanted, misfits, washouts, men waiting for permanent assignments. Boyington named it VMF 214, and the men, with the gallows humor of people who expected not to survive the year, called themselves the Black Sheep. He led from the front, drank hard between missions, and openly disdained the polish other commanders demanded of their pilots. He was also, by the numbers, one of the most effective fighter leaders the Marine Corps produced in the entire Pacific War. Flying the same dive-and-climb tactics that VMF 124 had bled to learn, Boyington's squadron tore through Japanese air units over Bougainville and Rabaul in the final months of 1943, and Boyington himself climbed toward the top of the American ace list. He had shot down more than 20 enemy aircraft, by his own count in the Corps, when the string ran out. While Boyington's reputation was being built in the air over Rabaul, the man who had first proven the Corsair could win in that same airspace was already gone. Kenneth Walsh, a first lieutenant with Jice's old squadron, VMF 124, became the first Corsair ace in the Pacific, and on August 30, 1943, shot down 4 Japanese Zeros in a single engagement before having to ditch his damaged fighter in the water off Vella Le Vella. He would receive the Medal of Honor for it, becoming the first Corsair pilot so decorated, and would survive the war entirely, a rare bright thread in a story otherwise full of men who did not get that ending. Across the widening Solomons campaign through late 1943, more Marine and Navy squadrons converted to the Corsair as production ramped up at Vaught's Connecticut plant, and soon, at licensed lines run by Goodyear and Brewster. What had been a single troubled squadron's problem in February 1943 was, by year's end, becoming the standard equipment of American land-based fighter aviation across the entire theater. Squadron after squadron rotated through the same island strips that had once seemed impossibly dangerous to fly from Munda. The Russells, Bougainville, and each new unit arrived with more flight hours, better maintenance support, and a body of hard-won tactical knowledge that the earliest Corsair pilots had paid for in wrecked airframes and missing friends. The airplane that had needed rescuing from its own reputation in February was, by autumn, the single most requested fighter in the theater, and Japanese pilots who had once welcomed the sight of American fighters as easy kills were starting to write home with a different tone entirely. Saburo Sakai was one of them, though his war had already been interrupted in ways that reshaped everything about how he saw the fight. On August 7, 1942, in a dogfight over Guadalcanal, American gunners aboard a formation of Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers put a burst of fire through Sakai's cockpit, killing 2 crewmen he was flying with and tearing through his own skull and upper body. Blind in one eye, partially paralyzed down one side, drifting in and out of consciousness, Sakai flew his crippled Zero nearly 600 miles back to Rabaul on dead reckoning and volcanic landmarks, landing with his fuel gauge on empty. Surgeons operated without full anesthesia. He kept the eye socket but never the vision in it. He would not return to combat for nearly 2 years. When he finally did, flying again despite being officially half-blind, the airplane he came back to was not the airplane he remembered. His private letters and later writings describe, with a candor unusual for a wartime combat pilot, a growing and unwelcome respect for the American fighters now filling the sky, their armor, their durability, the way a Corsair could absorb hits that would have turned his old Zero into a fireball. He did not call it fear, not directly. He called it more than once, a recognition that the war had changed shape while he was recovering, and that the airplane's old advantages, speed of turn, reach, the pilot's own skill, mattered less and less against machines that could simply survive being hit and hit back regardless. It is worth pausing on a detail that neither side found easy to admit at the time. The claims each Air Force made about the other, in the heat of 1943 and 1944, were consistently, dramatically inflated, not through deliberate deception in most cases, but through the genuine chaos of fast, high-altitude combat where 2 or 3 pilots often fired on the same falling aircraft, and each claimed it independently. American squadrons in the Pacific would eventually be credited, in post-war Marine Corps and Navy accounting, with an overall kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, sometimes cited as high as 11-1 for the Corsair specifically, a figure that has been treated with real skepticism by later historians, who note it compares raw victory claims against confirmed enemy losses gathered from incomplete wartime records on the Japanese side, and likely overstates the true ratio substantially. Japanese claims were, if anything, even less reliable by the later years of the war, as squadron records disintegrated along with the squadrons themselves. Saburo Sakai's own total, 28 confirmed by Japanese official records, as high as 64 in some Western retellings drawn from his own recollections, sits at the center of exactly this problem. None of this diminishes what these men did in the air. It only means the numbers that built the legends on both sides were softer than the legends themselves ever let on. What was not soft, and could not be argued away by either side's propaganda office, was the machinery underneath the claims, the training pipeline that produced the pilots in the first place. Here is the reveal the whole story has been building toward, and it has nothing to do with turning radius or dive speed. In the years before the war, Japanese naval pilot training was, by any standard, extraordinary 3 years of instruction, brutally selective washout rates, producing a small corps of pilots as skilled as any in the world. That system was built to arm a peacetime navy and a short, decisive war. It was never built to survive a war of attrition. When Japan's veteran aviators began dying in large numbers over Guadalcanal and the Solomons in 1942 and 1943, men like Junichi Sasai, killed on August 26, 1942, just 19 days into the campaign that was supposed to be another easy Japanese victory. There was no way for a training program graduating a few thousand pilots a year to replace them at the same quality. The Imperial Navy did expand its program sharply through 1943 and 1944, but flight hours per graduate collapsed as the war ground on, driven down further by an American submarine campaign that was quietly strangling the fuel supply Japan needed just to keep training aircraft in the air. By 1944, many Japanese pilots were reaching frontline squadrons with under 100 hours of flight time. The United States Navy and Marine Corps, over the same years, did the opposite. Even as demand for pilots exploded, American training requirements were pushed upward, not down. New carrier pilots by 1944 were expected to carry a minimum of roughly 400 to 500 hours and 2 years of training before reaching a fleet squadron. Across the whole of the Pacific War, the U.S. Navy alone trained more than 60,000 pilots, well over double the entire wartime output of Japanese naval aviation, and trained them, on average, to a far higher and more consistent standard. The zero did not get worse. The pilots flying it did, not from any lack of courage, but because the country behind them could no longer afford to build them the way it once had. The Corsair, meanwhile, kept arriving in the hands of pilots who had more hours, more armor, and more airplane behind them, squadron after squadron after squadron. The visible weapon had never really been the deciding factor. It was the invisible pipeline behind it, the training hours, the fuel, the industrial capacity to keep making both, that quietly decided who would still be flying by 1945. There is one more thread running through this story that neither side could have scripted, and it belongs to a man who, technically, had no business being in a cockpit at all. Charles Lindbergh, still, in 1944, the most famous pilot alive in America, 17 years removed from his solo Atlantic crossing, arrived in the South Pacific that April as a civilian technical representative for United Aircraft, the Corsair's manufacturer. His job on paper was narrow: observe Marine Corsair squadrons, gather technical data, help pilots extend the airplane's range and bomb-carrying capacity. Neither the White House nor the Secretary of the Navy knew the trip was happening. Lindbergh had no military rank, no combat orders, and technically no authorization to fire a gun in anger. He flew his first combat mission anyway on May 22, 1944, escorting torpedo bombers to Rabaul with a Marine Corsair squadron and strafing ground targets on the way home. Over the following weeks, he flew more than a dozen additional Corsair combat sorties into some of the most heavily defended airspace left in Japanese hands, including repeated missions against the same Rabaul stronghold that had already claimed William Jies and would soon claim Gregory Boyington. Restless for a different kind of flying, he later talked his way into the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning with the Army's 475th Fighter Group in New Guinea, and on July 28, 1944, in a head-on pass during a bomber escort mission, he shot down a Japanese aircraft, his only confirmed aerial victory of the war, scored not in the Corsair that first brought him to the Pacific, but in the twin-engine fighter he'd gone looking for afterward. Days later, he nearly became a casualty himself, saved only by another pilot's gun camera and quick reflexes over the Palau Islands. When word of his combat flying reached senior commanders, the response was immediate irritation rather than celebration. The squadron commander who had let him fly was formally reprimanded, and Lindbergh, politely but firmly, was grounded and sent home. The most famous aviator in the country had gone to the Pacific to study an airplane, and ended up proving, almost as an aside, exactly how far the American training and equipment advantage had come. A 50-something-hour-a-week civilian with no combat currency could climb into a Corsair and survive missions that were killing trained Japanese veterans by the dozen. By late 1944, that advantage had become impossible for the Imperial High Command to ignore, and Japan's response was not a better fighter. It was a different kind of war entirely. In October 1944, as American forces pushed into the Philippines, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi organized the first dedicated kamikaze unit. Young, hastily trained pilots ordered to crash bomb-laden aircraft directly into American ships, because the Imperial Navy no longer had enough skilled pilots or serviceable aircraft to win a conventional air battle against the carrier fleets it now faced. It was not a tactic born of confidence. It was a tactic born of exactly the shortage this story has been tracing from the beginning. Not enough trained men, not enough fuel, not enough airframes, and an air force that had run out of any other way to make its remaining aircraft matter. Onishi told the first volunteer pilots gathered before him at Mabalacat Airfield that Japan's situation had become so desperate that 100 million yen aircraft flown by a poorly trained 19-year-old, aimed once and correctly, was now worth more to the empire than the same pilot sent up for a conventional dogfight. He had almost no chance of surviving anyway. It was, in its own grim way, an admission of everything this story has already shown, that the training pipeline had collapsed so far that a single deliberate impact had become more reliable than an actual air battle. Zeros, by then stripped of much of their remaining armament to carry a single bomb, became one of the primary aircraft used in these missions. The same lightweight airframe Jiro Horikoshi had built for speed and range now repurposed as a one-way weapon, because it was one of the only aircraft Japan still had in numbers. Gregory Boyington did not live to see any of that unfold from the ground. On January 3, 1944, leading a fighter sweep over Rabaul, his Corsair was shot down. He ditched in the water, was picked up by a Japanese submarine, and vanished from every American record. For weeks, nobody knew whether he was alive. The Marine Corps, working from his known combat record, submitted him for the Medal of Honor as a presumed dead war hero. On October 5, 1945, after the war had already ended, President Harry Truman personally presented the Medal of Honor to Lieutenant Colonel Gregory Boyington in a White House ceremony, because it had, by then, been confirmed that the presumed dead pilot was in fact very much alive. He had spent the intervening 20 months as a prisoner in Japanese custody, enduring beatings, starvation, and 80 pounds of lost body weight, unaware for most of that time that the country he'd left behind believed him a fallen hero rather than a captive one. By the time Boyington was liberated in August 1945, the campaign that had defined the Corsair's reputation was already over, and it ended the way this story's thesis insists it had to. Not with Rabaul falling to an American invasion, but with the great Japanese stronghold simply withering on the vine. Allied commanders made the deliberate decision to bypass Rabaul entirely, rather than assault its heavy defenses directly, cutting its supply lines and leaving nearly 100,000 Japanese troops and the remnants of Japan's once feared air groups isolated there for the rest of the war, starved of fuel, spare parts, and above all replacement pilots, until the base that had launched Sasai and Sakai and thousands of other Zero sorties simply stopped being able to fight back in any meaningful way. It was not defeated by American firepower in a final climactic battle. It was hollowed out from the inside, exactly as the training pipelines on both sides had been hollowing out or filling up for 2 years already. What became of the people who carried this story is, in the end, its own kind of accounting. William Jies never came home. His squadron carried on without him under new commanders, and by the war's end, VMF 124 had claimed 78 enemy aircraft and helped pioneer Marine carrier operations aboard the USS Essex, a milestone he never lived to see, and a vindication that arrived, for him personally, 2 years too late to matter. Kenneth Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed victories, kept flying for the Marine Corps for decades afterward, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and died in 1998 as one of the most decorated Marine aviators in American history. Jiro Horikoshi never flew a combat mission himself. He spent the rest of his career in Japanese industry, wrote a memoir defending the design trade-offs he'd made in 1937, while expressing quiet, lasting regret over what his airplane had ultimately been used for, and died in Tokyo in January 1982, having lived just long enough to watch the country he'd helped arm rebuild itself into an industrial power on entirely different terms. Charles Lindbergh went home to a grounding order and a diminished public reputation that had never fully recovered from his pre-war isolationist politics. He spent his later years as a conservationist and writer, quietly influential in early environmental policy circles, and died in Hawaii in 1974. Saburo Sakai survived his own war entirely, became a committed pacifist and lay Buddhist who said he prayed daily for the souls of the men he had killed on both sides, ran a small printing business that deliberately employed fellow veterans who could find work nowhere else, and died of a heart attack in September 2000, fittingly, and almost unbelievably, as the guest of honor at a formal dinner held for him by the United States Navy at Atsugi. Gregory Boyington came home to fame, 4 marriages, chronic alcoholism, and a life he himself described with characteristic bluntness. "Show me a hero," he liked to say, "and I'll show you a bum." He worked odd jobs afterward, including a stint refereeing professional wrestling matches, and consulted on a television series based loosely on his own squadron that most of his surviving pilots later said got the story wrong. He died of cancer in January 1988, buried at Arlington National Cemetery beside, by pure coincidence of plot assignment, the boxer Joe Louis. The airplane outlived nearly all of them. Vought and its licensed partners built more than 12,000 Corsairs before production finally ended in 1953. A production run stretching an extraordinary 13 years for a single fighter design, almost unheard of in an era when aircraft became obsolete within a handful of years. It fought on through the Korean War as a ground attack aircraft, flying its last American combat missions there nearly a decade after that disastrous first outing over Kahili, and versions of it flew on in smaller air forces around the world for years after that. The Zero, by contrast, effectively died with the empire that built it. Mitsubishi's production lines were bombed, dismantled, or converted. The thousands of airframes still scattered across the Pacific by August 1945 were burned, dumped, or simply abandoned where they sat, on island airstrips that the war had already passed by. Its name survives now mostly in memory, in museum restorations built from salvaged parts, and in the wrecked, rusting hulks that divers still find resting in Pacific lagoons today, exactly where they went down. There is a version of this story that ends there, with production numbers and a tidy contrast between an airplane that endured and one that didn't. But the real ending sits somewhere else, in the years right after the war, when Japan, stripped of its air force, its navy, and most of its industrial base, turned the exact same engineering instincts that had built the Zero toward an entirely different kind of competition. The relentless pursuit of lightness, precision, and efficiency that Jiro Horikoshi had poured into a fighter plane in 1937 became, within a generation, the founding philosophy of a new Japanese industrial economy, one that would spend the following decades out-engineering the rest of the world in cameras, electronics, and automobiles, using the same obsessive attention to weight and efficiency that had once made the finest fighter of its era, and then, just as surely, doomed it. It is a strange kind of continuity, watching a nation take the exact same engineering discipline that once produced the deadliest fighter in the Pacific and redirect it, within a single generation, toward transistor radios and compact cars instead of cannon and carrier decks, and stranger still to realize that the discipline itself was never the problem. Lightness, precision, and relentless optimization built the Zero, and 20 years later, built an economic miracle. What had been missing in 1942 was never engineering brilliance. It was the deep, unglamorous infrastructure standing behind the brilliant machine, the training seats, the fuel reserves, the replacement pipelines, the parts of a war effort that never make it into a recruiting poster or a newsreel, and that decide, almost silently, who is still flying by the time the shooting stops. The lesson those Kahili survivors carried home in February 1943, without fully understanding it yet, was never really about which fighter was faster or which pilot was braver. It was about what a nation could afford to lose, and how long it could keep replacing what it lost, and what happened to even the finest machine in the world once the people behind it ran out of time to learn how to fly it. The airplane won the myth. The system behind it won the war.